You understand a pattern, you know it's not helping you, you genuinely want to change it, and yet you still find yourself repeating it.
But understanding something consciously and being able to live differently automatically are not the same things. And the gap between the two is where the unconscious becomes therapeutically relevant. So, when a client tells you, I know what I should do, but I am still not able to do it, that inability points us towards the unconscious. Because if it were fully under conscious control, the client should simply decide and execute. Suppose a person carries a deep belief that says, no one really loves me. Now, if someone genuinely cares for them, reassures them, includes them, or says something affectionate, they may not be fully able to receive it. They may dismiss it, distrust it, reinterpret it, or tell themselves they are just being nice because they want something. They do not really mean it. But if the same person receives criticism, indifference, or even a small sign of distance, the information fits their existing beliefs and therefore enters much more easily.
So, therapy is not about forcing the mind to obey, it is about helping the mind to feel safe enough to adopt a better pattern.
The unconscious is not the enemy. Many a times it is carrying an old survival strategy. And when therapy helps that part of the mind feel safe enough to update, patterns that once felt permanent can begin to shift much more naturally.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Beyond Insights. I am Ms. Basha, practicing psychologist, co-founder of Meet Goals at ICHARS. I specialize in implementing emotional mental wellness solutions in corporates. And in each episode of this series, we take one important idea from therapy, coaching, and change work and break it down in a way that is practical, clinically useful, and relevant not just for the practitioners, but also for anyone trying to understand how change actually happens. And joining me, as always, is Nitin Shah, psychotherapist, trainer, co founder of ICHARS, and someone known for making complex therapeutic ideas easier to understand without oversimplifying them. Nitin, welcome back.
Thank you, Ms. Good to be back.
So, today's conversation begins with something almost everyone has experienced in one form or another. You understand a pattern, you know it's not helping you, you genuinely want to change it, and yet you still find yourself repeating it. You tell yourself, I won't react like this again, and then you do. And you promise yourself this is the last time, and then this isn't. The relationship isn't healthy, a habit is a harmful habit, a fear is irrational, and still something inside you keeps pulling you back. So, today we are exploring a very important question. If conscious mind wants change, what keeps running the old pattern? And that's what brings us to the unconscious mind in therapy. Now, before we go deeper, I want to build a little continuity for viewers who have been following the series. In one of our earlier episodes on attachment issues in adults, we explored how the label a client uses is often not the actual problem. In other words, saying I have attachment issues may describe a pattern, but it doesn't necessarily explain what is maintaining that pattern. So today we go one layer deeper and we just not ask what pattern is. We are asking what part of the mind keeps that pattern running automatically. Nathan, over to you.
Yes, and that is a very important distinction because many people assume that once they understand the issue, change should happen automatically. But understanding something consciously and being able to live differently automatically are not the same things. And the gap between the two is where the unconscious becomes therapeutically relevant.
All right, so let's start right there because the word unconscious can sound vague, abstract, or even mystical to some people. When you use the word in therapy, what exactly does that mean?
So, for therapeutic purposes, let's define this a bit more functionally. The conscious mind is the part with which you think, analyze, compare, decide, reason, and make choices deliberately. The unconscious mind is the part where repeated learning, emotional conditioning, habits, automatic responses, involuntary patterns, and past associations continue to influence the person, often without deliberate effort. So, when a client tells you, I know what I should do, but I am still not able to do it, that inability points us towards the unconscious. Because if it were fully under conscious control, the client should simply decide and execute.
That is such a useful way to frame it. So the conscious mind choose the destination, but the unconscious often determines what feels natural, believable, and automatic in the moment.
Exactly. And this is why a client can say, I want to stop smoking. I want to stop overthinking. I want to leave this unhealthy relationship. I want to stop self sabotaging. Or I want to feel more confident and still not be able to follow through consistently. Consciously, the decision may already be made. Unconsciously, the system may still be organized around the old pattern.
So then, why does insight so often fail to produce the lasting change?
Because this is something many people struggle with. They read books, they watch videos, they gain awareness, they can even explain their patterns beautifully, and yet the actual patterns remain. And yes, this is where we need to understand that awareness is valuable, but awareness by itself is not always sufficient. A person may understand the issue intellectually, but under stress, fatigue, loneliness, fear, conflict, uncertainty, the older conditioned responses can still take over. So, if the mind has learned over the years that a certain way of thinking, feeling, or behaving is what keeps you safe, then one good insight does not necessarily erase all that conditioning. It may begin the process, yes, but if the insight has not been integrated at an unconscious level, the old response can continue to run on autopilot.
That word autopilot is very important here. Because when people hear unconscious, they think of something dramatic or hidden deep inside, whereas in reality, we are talking about something active in everyday life.
Correct. The unconscious is not some rare or exotic phenomenon. It is active all the time. When you brush your teeth without thinking through each movement, when you drive and suddenly realize you do not remember the last few turns clearly, and yet you've reached your destination effectively. When your hand reaches for your phone before you consciously register your anxiety, when the alarm rings and one part of you wants to get up while another part automatically snoozes it, you are already seeing unconscious processes at work. Similarly, in relationships, if someone does not reply to your messages and your mind immediately goes to rejection, abandonment, anger, panic, or self blame, that reaction is usually not being freshly invented in that moment. It is often an automatic pattern based on prior learning.
And that is where a lot of suffering comes from, not just from what happens outside, but from how the mind has learned to interpret what happens outside.
Yes, which brings us to another important concept, critical filter.
Yes, let's talk about that because this is where the whole thing becomes very practical. If a client understands something new, What stops that new understanding from fully sinking in?
So, a major part of the answer lies in what I mentioned earlier, critical filter. The critical filter is the mechanism through which incoming information gets checked against existing beliefs, patterns, or prior learning. If the new information fits what the person already believes in, it is much easier for that information to go in and become a part of the unconscious. But if it does not fit, the system may reject it, distort it, or delete it.
An example for that.
Suppose a person carries a deep belief that says, no one really loves me. Now, if someone genuinely cares for them, reassures them, includes them, or says something affectionate, they may not be fully able to receive it. They may dismiss it, distrust it, reinterpret it, or tell themselves they are just being nice because they want something. They do not really mean it. But if the same person receives criticism, indifference, or even a small sign of distance, the information fits their existing beliefs and therefore enters much more easily.
So the issue is not just that new information is available, the issue is whether the person's internal system is able to receive it as a true, safe, and believable.
Correct. And this is one of the reasons people can remain stuck even when the right advice is available to them. Advice operates at one level, conditioning operates at another.
Okay, so that also changes how we think about resistance in therapy. Because many times when clients do not change quickly, people say they are resistant, defensive, blocked, or unwilling. But your approach often reframes that completely.
Yes, because from a therapeutic point of view, resistance is often better understood as protection. And this is extremely important. Most clients are not sitting in front of you trying to sabotage their own healing for no reason. And usually the unconscious is holding on to a pattern because at some point that pattern seemed necessary for survival, stability, maybe self-protection, emotional safety, or even for a sense of belongingness. So if someone overthinks, avoids intimacy, shuts down in conflict, people pleases, maybe becomes hyper vigilant, stays with familiar even when it is painful, or maybe even numbs themselves through habits. The pattern often has some protective history behind it.
That is such a powerful shift because the moment resistance as a protection rather than as a sabotage, the whole therapeutic stance changes.
Exactly. When you see resistance as protection, you try to understand what the system is trying to protect and whether it is now willing to update that strategy.
So, therapy is not about forcing the mind to obey, it is about helping the mind to feel safe enough to adopt a better pattern.
Yes, that is a much more accurate way of putting it. Because the unconscious does not respond well to being bullied. It responds better when change feels relevant, believable, and safe.
So, can we go a little deeper into how therapists actually work with this? Because someone listening may now understand the idea, but they may still wonder what does working with the unconscious actually look like in practice?
So that's a good question. First, one needs to identify the gap between what the client consciously wants and what they are unconsciously able to do.
Okay.
That gap itself gives us a lot of information. Second, one needs to understand what is maintaining the old pattern. Is it a belief, a fear, an internal image, a repeated story, an emotional association, a habit loop, or an unprocessed experience, or maybe even a protective conclusion the person arrived at earlier in their life? Third, the therapist has to communicate in ways that the client system can actually receive.
And the last point is bigger than people realize because even when two clients have similar issues, they may not respond to the same kind of language, the same kind of explanation, or the same kind of intervention, also.
True. Some clients respond well to direct cognitive clarity, some need repetition, some need experiential work, some need the issue to be felt differently in the body. Some need symbolic or imagination based work, while some others need the internal conflict to be negotiated rather than corrected. And that is why therapy is not simply the act of feeling someone's truth. It is the act of helping the truth enter the system in a form that the system can use.
That line is worth sitting with because people assume that if the right idea has been said, the work is done. But therapy is not only about what is said, it is also about whether the client's mind can receive, process, and live that idea.
Yes. And from that point of view, even cognitive approaches are often trying to influence the unconscious more than people realize. For example, if a client is asked to repeat a new thought over and over until it becomes conditioned, what are we really trying to do? We are really trying to ensure that the new response becomes automatic, which means eventually we want the unconscious to begin running it.
So, even when therapy looks conscious, part of the goal is still unconscious integration.
Absolutely. The question is whether the unconscious is involved. The question is whether we are working with it consciously and skillfully or assuming that insight alone will somehow trickle down on its own.
Okay, so what about hypnosis in this context? Because once people hear unconscious mind, they naturally connect it with hypnosis, and often they either romanticize it or misunderstand it.
Yes, and that misunderstanding needs correction. But to be fair, people also misunderstand therapy. So that misunderstanding can exist at multiple levels for multiple reasons. But coming back to hypnosis, hypnosis can be understood as a state of increased receptivity or suggestibility, and also as a process that helps us bypass the critical filter, enough for certain kinds of change work to happen more effectively. But even here, the client's willingness is a prerequisite. A client is not a passive object in hypnosis. They are not there to blindly receive whatever is said. If a client is unwilling to explore a change, the system will reject what does not fit. So, for example, if I have a client who wants to quit smoking, I can use hypnosis to help them create that or bridge that gap between their conscious choice of wanting to quit and whether their unconscious is able to help them quit or not. Right? But if someone comes and tells me it's my dream to die with 5 cigarettes in my mouth, right? And they're not willing to quit smoking, then I can't use hypnosis to help them quit smoking. So willingness is a prerequisite and is an extremely important part of the entire process.
Okay, I'm glad you said that because it also keeps the conversation ethical. So the unconscious is not some loophole through which the therapist imposes change.
Correct. The client's willingness, as I mentioned earlier, matters. Their values matter. Their readiness matters. Their understanding matters. At times, the first part of therapy is not changing the unconscious directly, but helping the client consciously understand why a change matters, what may maintain the old pattern, how the old pattern is costing them, and what future becomes possible if they are able to update it.
So conscious work and unconscious work are not opponents, they are partners, right?
True. The conscious mind can identify the direction it wants to take. The unconscious must become comfortable enough to support that movement.
Okay. So can you give a practical example that brings these two together for our viewers?
Let's take a simple example about public speaking.
Okay.
A person may consciously know that giving one presentation will not kill them. They may even know they are well prepared. But the moment they imagine standing in front of people, their body reacts, their heart races, their mind goes blank. They end up predicting humiliation. And the whole system behaves as if danger is imminent. Now, if you only tell them there is nothing to worry about, you're addressing the conscious mind, but that they already know consciously. But if the unconscious is already linked public speaking with danger, embarrassment, rejection, or shame, then that logic may not be enough. Therapy then has to help the system update the internal story, the felt response, the expectations, and the automatic meanings associated with that experience.
Okay. And that is a point where therapy becomes much more than an advice because advice tells the person what they actually should do, and therapy helps the system become more able to do it actually.
So, to be fair, therapy does not become much more than advice because therapy is not advice. As a part of the therapeutic process, generally speaking, advice has no role to play, right? The direction comes from the client's conscious mind. We may ask questions and not advice, but when we are asking questions, the clients may get clarity about what direction they want to take. Therapy is more about helping them take the direction, get the clarity, take the direction. And that is why I keep emphasizing alignment. All therapy and coaching at some level is about creating alignment between what the client chooses consciously and what they're able to do unconsciously.
That feels like one of the central ideas of this entire episode. As if two are aligned, change feels easier and more natural and more sustainable. And if they are not aligned, people experience conflict.
Correct. And that conflict is often what client describes in everyday language when they say, a part of me wants this, but another part of me doesn't. Or I don't know why I keep doing this. Or sometimes you will even hear clients saying, something inside me stops me.
I also want to bring this back to the relationships for a moment because that was a strong thread in our earlier attachment related discussion. Would it be fair to say that many relationships pattern people label as attachment issues can also be understood as unconscious safety strategies?
In many cases, yes. For
Okay.
example, what people call clinginess, withdrawal, testing, overanalysis, mistrust, panic around distance, or even emotional shutdown may all be maintained by automatic meanings and protective strategies that the mind has learned over time. So, if you only argue with the behavior, you may miss the fear beneath it. And if you miss that fear beneath it, the behavior may keep returning in new forms.
All right. That makes this episode feel like a natural continuation, but I also want to make sure new viewers can still stand fully inside this conversation, even if they have not watched the earlier episodes. So let me try to summarize the core idea so far. The unconscious mind in therapy is not some mysterious separate entity. It is a part of the system where repeated learning becomes automatic. It influences habits, emotional reactions, body responses, protective patterns, and the meanings we assign to such situations. And if change has not reached that level, a person may understand the issue consciously, yet still repeat it automatically.
So that's been put very well.
Okay, then let us take the next practical question. How do we know therapy is actually working at that level?
Okay, so that's an interesting question and a question that every therapist or coach should have an answer for, right? And it surprises me from time to time how many people don't actually have an answer to this question who are practicing as therapists and coaches. So you have to understand that many people use relief as the measure for effectiveness of therapy. Sometimes people would say, I felt good after the session, and assume that means change has happened. Feeling better has value, yes, but from a therapeutic point of view, we also need observable change. If
Okay.
therapy is working, the client should begin noticing tangible shifts. A trigger feels less intense, a new response becomes easier, an old urge weakens, a difficult conversation becomes possible, a recurring thought changes, the body settles faster, or the person behaves differently in situations where they were previously stuck.
So basically, real change has evidence, not just in session, but also in practical life, day-to-day life.
Yes, because ultimately therapy is not being done for a beautiful explanation of what's happening in the client's life. It is being done to create a meaningful shift. And it's again when a client comes to us seeking help, they're very tangible problems that they're noticing in their day-to-day life. So all we need to do is be able to make a note of them and then keep track of them on a week by week basis, on a session by session basis to notice where the shift has taken place and where we still need to work.
All right. So before we close, I want to ask one final question. If someone is listening to this and recognizing themselves in it, what is the one important takeaway they should leave with?
So I would say this. If you keep repeating a pattern you genuinely want to change, it does not automatically mean you're weak, lazy, irrational, or incapable. Very often, it means some part of your system has learned that the old pattern is still necessary. And the work is not to hate that part of yourself. The work is to understand what is it that it is protecting and help it discover a better, safer, a more adapted or updated way of protecting you.
That is such an important place to land because it takes us away from self-judgment and more towards curiosity and from fighting the mind to working with it, actually.
Yes, the unconscious is not the enemy. Many a times it is carrying an old survival strategy. And when therapy helps that part of the mind feel safe enough to update, patterns that once felt permanent can begin to shift much more naturally.
Okay, so that also sets up our next conversation beautifully because once we understand that the unconscious does not always respond best to direct logic, the next question becomes what kind of communication does it respond to better? That is exactly where we are exploring the next episode. And the episode goes by the topic why metaphors work better than logic in therapy. Why do stories, symbols, indirect communication, metaphors often create a moment where explanation and logic alone does not do it? We will explore that in our next episode, which is episode number 9. Thank you, Nitin, for this deep, clarifying episode.
Thank you, Misbah, for hosting this episode, for asking the questions you've asked, because it also gives a lot of clarity, not for just the people who are listening to us, or who are watching us, but also to us, because many a times in those conversations, new ideas emerge, and then that also allows us to update our courses, to update information that is available with us. And sometimes it gives us food for thought because of which we can go ahead and explore more, learn more. So thank you once again for hosting this conversation. This has been amazing fun.
All right. Thank you, everyone who joined us for this episode of Beyond Insights. I'm Ms. Basha. And this has been a conversation on why insight is not always enough, why working with the unconscious mind is such an important part of therapy. We will see you all in the next episode.
Thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you.